Remember when there was a time long, long ago in the distant past of 2008 where you just go and see a film and you just left, no worries on your mind? If it got a sequel, cool. If it didn't, meh. The film wrapped up everything perfectly anyways. No need to pull out your phone and quickly Google, does Cocaine Bear have a post-credit scene? It absolutely does, by the way. Spoiler alert, I guess. Slight spoiler alert for a lot of films, actually, but don't worry, nothing major. Post-credit scenes were always a bit of a fun reward for sticking around for a little bit longer. Congratulations, you stayed back a few more minutes. Here's a little thing to help make it worth your while. Think of them like a band doing an encore song, just that one little bit, just to leave the audience satisfied. Recently, I saw Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse. Phenomenal film, but I don't want to get too deep into it. But there's 3 simple words on screen that soured a good number of fans on the film. To be continued. After the artistic stylized title card started going, we got to see the title of the next film, Beyond the Spider-Verse. The scrolling credits started going through, and everyone started realizing something was up, and they made their way out of the theater. The film had the audacity to not have an end credit scene, and this was apparently such a perceived problem that I've heard a handful of people grumble about on the way to their car. I'm fully aware that there's just a handful of people at my screening, and no one is entitled to an end credit scene, but the straw man does spot a big issue that I don't think anyone's really talking about. What got us to this point with post-credit scenes? They do serve an actual purpose, outside of promoting a franchise or a sequel. Don't worry, I'll get into that in a bit. But filmmakers have a long history of adding secret little scenes to the end of the credits to help entice audience members to stick around and watch the names of all the talented folks who made the movies we enjoy. With every single film ever made, somewhere out there, many people worked long hours for weeks at a time to create something for you to enjoy. From the big-name celebrities down to someone who just got their start as a production assistant. They can proudly point to their name as it scrolls by because their name is now etched in Hollywood history forever. I mean, even if that film is a dumpster fire, they're a part of history now. It's also important to note that for much of filmmaking's early years, not everyone in the production was credited. Studios used to work under a contract system, meaning cast and crew were signed exclusively to a given studio. Pay was abysmal, conditions were rough, and being an electrician who set up the lighting was just your job, and your role on set as a gaffer meant nothing to the executives. The credits that did exist were usually always front-loaded, and usually only consisted of the star talent or department heads, also known as the above-the-line cast and crew. You might see the production designer, but never the person who painted the sets, and when the film was finished, that was it. And when people saw it in theaters, that's why you'd always get the end title card saying "The End" as the final frame of the film. And if there was something at the end, maybe a few static cards with credits for the actors who had speaking roles with their characters' names on it. But this was nowhere near the standard practice like it is today. Technically, the very first post-credit scene was 1966's The Silencers. I say technically because the audience really only had to wait for like 30 seconds of stills from the film to keep them entertained while the main character, Matt Helm, was surrounded by a bunch of barely dressed women, and it directly told the audience to expect the sequel, Murderers Row. I know most people think of Ferris Bueller's Day Off because, it was also parodied in Deadpool, but even the Muppets movie did the exact same joke of, what are you still doing here? Go home, first, in 1979. Films with opening credits were the norm up through the 70s, but is much more rare today. Disney Studios' last one was Lilo and Stitch, and today they're mostly just used by art films or James Bond films, which are still trying to hold on to a relic of the past. This big shift came in 1977, Star Wars: A New Hope. I mean, of course, my inner film nerd won't let me get away without mentioning Fantasia, Citizen Kane, Around the World in 80 Days, West Side Story, 2001, Space Odyssey, and The Godfather, which all premiered without or with very minor opening credits. But Star Wars' iconic opening narration crawl instead of the credits, because the credits are now at the very end of the film, became the new standard because of how massive Star Wars went on to become. Side tangent here. There's an often cited rumor that this act actually got George Lucas kicked out of the Directors Guild. It didn't. He signed a waiver to let him do this for A New Hope, and the DGA usually doesn't step on the toes of creatives like this. The actual problem came with An Empire Strikes Back, which wasn't directed by Lucas but Irvin Kershner. The issue wasn't that it didn't have the opening credits, but if they don't have any credits at the beginning, the director needs to be credited. This is why you always see a single title card like a Quentin Tarantino film or a Spike Lee joint in front of the films they direct. Empire had the opening cards for 20th Century Fox as the studio, and then the production company, which was a Lucasfilm limited production. It's all a weird argument over having Lucas's name in the production company, so he just paid the fine and quit the guild. But speaking of films that came out in the year 1980, this actually brings us to the start of a long-forgotten art form in keeping audiences engaged throughout the end credits. Smokey and the Bandit 2's end credits blooper reel. This used to be a staple for decades when it came to comedies. As the credits scrolled by, you'd always see their names on the left and the right, and a little look behind the scenes as the actors fumbled their lines, the props didn't work properly, or just alternate takes on improvised lines. I mean, think about it. What better way to leave your audience feeling like they laughed a lot during your comedy than have a bunch of funny clips that were already filmed and you didn't need to worry about trying to fit into the overall story? Rush Hour had them, nearly every Jim Carrey film had them. Even Pixar had fun with these, and they even animated some of their outtakes for A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, and The Incredibles. I mean, some of them did seem like actual genuine goofs, but, they did lean into the idea pretty heavily. And it's a shame this is a dying trend. End credit blooper reels are still around, but not too often. Films like Adam Sandler's Hubie Halloween and Ticket to Paradise starring George Clooney and Julia Roberts had them, but this is still few and far between. There's kind of a few different reasons for the decline in blooper reels and the end of credits nowadays. I mean, for one, most people watch films in the comfort of their homes on streaming services, and the credits on streaming services look like this. You can't really take in the humor when Netflix is trying to push the next thing onto you. Then there's the fact that there just aren't too many comedies being made these days. And even that is an entire can of worms to unpack. But in short, comedy is very subjective to a very specific audience. Meaning, comedies aren't expected to perform too well in overseas markets. Even one of the highest grossing comedies of all time, Bruce Almighty, only made half of its box office overseas. And that's on the high end of the scale. For context, big blockbuster movies can usually see around 70 to 80% of its return from somewhere outside of the US. But if I have to say, the biggest reason why credit outtakes stopped being used to keep audiences watching to find people who made the film is because in the mid to late 2000s, they started to become in-continuity sequel teases as the end credits scene. Although I do want to mention the short-lived experiment just before this period with musical performances during the end credits, like we saw in Rat Race, Freaky Friday, and School of Rock. Ah, good times. Anyways, starting in the 2000s, end credit scenes were a bit more comedic and just little fun moments like Scooby-Doo and Shaggy eating peppers at the very end of the 2002 live-action film, or the Monkey Jack in Pirates of the Caribbean now being cursed, or even just Dom driving around for fun at the very end of Fast and the Furious 1. This was the norm until the most well-known and consequential post-credit scene known today. Nick Fury meeting Tony Stark at the end of Iron Man 1. The magic of the MCU is that it's built off the hype of the next interconnected thing for what's coming up next. And they use this tool for world building, and it's always been consistent. Hulk teased a connection to Iron Man 2 teased Thor teased S.H.I.E.L.D., Cap teased the Avengers teased Thanos in the mid-credit scene, and then we got the shawarma scene as the actual post-credit scene. Oh, and now starts the era where we get both mid- and post-credit scenes. And then we get Guardians of the Galaxy, which had 5. Marvel still has a good number of quirky, fun singers at the very end, and they've always laid the groundwork for an eventual film later on, even if die-hard fans already knew it was coming because of announcements at D23 or San Diego Comic-Con, or leaks. I think the only loose thread still dangling that doesn't have a clear answer to them from the Infinity Saga is probably what happened to Michael Mando's take on Scorpion. Although, if I'm being 100% honest with myself, what the audience was given at the end of each Phase 4 and Phase 5 film is, well, it's become too formulaic. The films end on what looks like they're going back to that sitcom love, back to square one, guys, for the next episode. And then, gasp, a new character appears where they say, no, it's not. And then they're never heard from again. We'll see if they're really invested in bringing Star Fox, Clea, and Hercules to theaters, but Clea does have a bit more room to work with, given her recent run in the comics as the new Doctor Strange, but that's really about it. There's still too recent to knock on, yet all of the scenes with Eddie Brock coming to the main MCU just to get drunk in Mexico and leave just feels like a wasted opportunity, you know? I will say, though, Black Panther Wakanda Forever's reveal of Toussaint as Prince T'Challa II was touching, so I will give it that. What I can make fun of is all the number of films that have tried to replicate the Marvel formula and failed. Terminator Genesis and Ghostbusters 2016 had a level of confidence I just wish I had sometimes. Even Universal's Dark Universe tried so hard to be a thing, but even they knew better than to end The Mummy with one, which leads us to possibly the worst batting average for upcoming projects teased by a post-credit scene. The DCEU. Man of Steel, BVS, and the first Wonder Woman film had none, so they're fine. Suicide Squad had Bruce Wayne trying to get info from Waller, which led to him fighting the rest of the Justice League. Perfect. But then we got Deathstroke in the theatrical release of the Justice League. Never happened. Black Manta and Aquaman maybe still might be upcoming in Aquaman 2. Dr. Shyvana in both Shazam films, no. Birds of Prey and Wonder Woman 84 get a pass since those are more comedic bits than anything else. But Peacemaker actually showing up from the end of the Suicide Squad to eventually his own show, which also teased the next episode, definitely happened. So, hey, that's a win. But man, no scene in the history of comic book movies hurts more than seeing Henry Cavill show up in Black Adam. The World of Warcraft-obsessed king of nerds himself came back to put on the big blue Boy Scout suit one last time to have a standoff with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's Black Adam. And it was going to shake up the hierarchy of power in the DCEU. Then the heartbreak sets in, knowing that this is going to go nowhere because James Gunn is rebooting everything, and maybe Shazam actually may have been a better fit for this scene. And then you also think of why was Superman working as an enforcer for Amanda Waller, but you know what, never mind. And that leads us to where we're at today. There's still a good number of reasons to stick around through the credits. All those fine working people who made the film deserve to have their recognition, even if their names are now lost in the sea of other people's names. And no one is forcing you to stick around. I mean, unless you happen to work at that movie theater and you're just waiting for everyone to leave so you can clean up all the popcorn in the aisleways. And if so, thank you for making Heartbreak feel good in a place like this. I mean, personally, I firmly agree with Scream 6's very meta post-credit scene where they said,
"Not every movie needs a post-credit scene."
Then again, it is also nice seeing a humor as close to a plot thread like they did in Dungeons & Dragons. But what do you guys think about the current state of post-credit scenes? Which method of keeping audiences watching the credits do you guys prefer the most? I'd love to read your comments down below. And if you enjoyed today's video, please hit that like button. And of course, subscribe for more weekly content on comic books and nerd stuff. I've been Eric, and you've been awesome.